Hi everyone, Jedediah Thomas here. Today I wanted to talk about what is trauma. So be sure to like and subscribe and follow along for more content on the mind, the subconscious mind, the conscious mind, motivation, limiting beliefs, trauma, and everything around that. So I've done quite a lot about limiting beliefs and kind of preventing trauma, what it's like to heal trauma. But now today I want to actually go into what trauma is. So in a nutshell, trauma is an evolutionary response to an external stimulus that makes us feel like our survival is threatened. Now that's that's quite a wordy way of putting it, but basically like when we feel like we're about to die, our body goes through a trauma response, right? And what a trauma response is basically it shuts down our higher conscious mind, and we operate entirely on our subconscious. And depending on how bad the situation is, we could go into a fully kind of like comatose like state where it looks like we're unconscious and we're not. And during that time, we're recording every single detail of everything that's happening around us so that we can avoid that situation again in the future. Now, there's actually a book that talks about this in much more detail. It's called Waking the Tiger by a psychologist named Peter Levine. And basically, the book serves two purposes. One, it describes what trauma is. My definition of trauma is exactly what he says in the book, and it tells you how to prevent trauma through his methodology of was it somatic something, right? It's basically somatic remembering, or I don't recall exactly what he calls it, but it's his idea of how you heal trauma. Now, from what everything that I know, that it doesn't actually heal trauma, but it is a necessary reaction to the healing of trauma. What that means is as you heal trauma, your body will start to shake and release the trauma, but that's not a sign that the shaking causes the healing. So let me make that even simpler. So when your trauma is healed, you shake, but when you shake, your trauma is not healed, right? So that's as simple as I can break it down, basically. So what that means is that his book is really good for understanding trauma. It's really good for preventing trauma, but it's not good for healing trauma, right? So what I do actually heals trauma. Now, to actually go into kind of what the book describes trauma is, it talks about how there's like a deer or an antelope that's like drinking water, and a tiger jumps out and attacks that deer or antelope, and immediately it just collapses like it's dead, right? And so the tiger is like chewing on its leg or attacking it or whatever, and it's just laying there, and it looks like it's dead, or if it's alive, it looks like it's unconscious, and it's not either one. It's actually in that trauma response state where the conscious mind has shut down. Right. So the tiger chews on it for a while, gets bored, and moves on. Right. Now the deer will stay like that for hours or however long it needs to until the point where it knows it's no longer in danger. At that point, it will reboot the conscious mind, and it will dart off, and there's no harm, no foul. Basically, the deer is not traumatized because that event was allowed to completely resolve, right? That trauma response does not necessarily create a traumatic imprint. So what is a traumatic imprint? A traumatic imprint is basically when that process gets interrupted, right? When that deer is in a comatose state, all of a sudden, maybe, lightning strikes and then freaks the deer out even worse than it was freaked out before. It jumps to now, for the rest of its life, that deer is going to have an association with tigers and lightning, right? Basically, the trauma response created a traumatic imprint where the danger became even more than the danger was before. And now for the rest of its life, every time it sees a tiger, it's going to think lightning. And every time it hears lightning, it's going to think of a tiger chewing on it, right? And it's going to be freaked out all the time if it encounters one of those two things, right? And what those two things are now are triggers for that traumatic imprint, right? So if the deer had been able to complete that process, there would be no traumatic imprint. It would just know, being eaten by tigers is bad, right? But it wouldn't suffer psychologically, right? But because that process got interrupted, now for the rest of its life, it has this traumatic imprint. Every time it gets triggered, it's going to shut down mentally and react as though either there's lightning or there's a tiger chewing on it. And that's not really a good way to survive. So the problem in our lives is that we often end up in situations that trigger a trauma response, but those same situations also prevent us from fully acting out that trauma response to release the trauma. And what happens is we get a traumatic imprint. And so that could happen, say, like in a car accident, right? You go into kind of that comatose state immediately afterwards, and then the firefighters come and like shake you and try and wake you up, and then now you're traumatized because you weren't able to actually finish that state. And it's the same thing with abuse, right? You get hit once, and then the traumatic situation doesn't end. You keep recording, and then that person keeps hitting you, and then so eventually you create a traumatic imprint because that situation is not ending, right? And so it is a little due to the fact that our lives are basically dangerous enough in the eyes of our subconscious to start that traumatic response, but they're also, not life-threatening enough that we know when that situation is over. So we basically just record a lot of stuff as traumatic imprints. So basically, this is a very wordy and lengthy conversation. There's a reason why I've held off on actually going into this, because like it is very science heavy, right? There's a lot of understanding that is involved in this to actually understand what trauma is. But basically speaking, is that anytime we encounter a situation that traumatized us, we will there for the rest of our lives be triggered by that situation. So you can imagine a soldier gets shot at in war. He believes he's about to die, and then he gets traumatized because, combat, you have to keep moving. You can't just, knock yourself out and heal. You've got to keep going, and then you get traumatized. So then maybe he goes home, everything seems fine, and then say someone pops a cork or something, or a balloon pops, and boom, right back into combat. And that's exactly what a traumatic imprint is. That's exactly what a traumatic trigger is. So what I do is I heal the traumatic situation. I allow that traumatic process to play out, and your body, your mind releases that trauma, and it's as though it never happened, even though it did. It still did, right? But all of the pain, all of the trauma is now gone, and now you're able to function normally. That thing never triggers you again because that trauma is now released. So all of this to say is that trauma is actually a lot more common than you think, right? So, okay, I've given examples like being beaten, a soldier in war, or a car accident. Those are very obvious traumas. But because our subconscious is so hyper alert to danger, it records a lot of other things as traumatic situations as well, right? If you're a kid and you walk into kindergarten for the first time and the kids turn and laugh at you, it believes its survival is threatened, so it creates traumatic imprint. If you're walking the door and your parent yells at you or is just disappointed in you, it starts a traumatic response because you feel like your survival is threatened, and it creates a traumatic imprint. And so the trauma that I heal is it ranges from the most mundane imaginable to the most extraordinary situations. And because I know what trauma is and I know how to release it, I can actually heal those traumas and you go back to normal. So there doesn't really have to be a stigma around trauma, right? There's a lot of people who love to stigmatize it because they're afraid of what happens when that trauma gets triggered, but they don't realize it can actually be healed, right? And so that's what I do. That's the work that I do, is I heal that trauma, and that trigger dissolves, right? Because the trauma is no longer there. Even though the situation still happened, the trauma itself is gone because I've allowed the mind, the body to play out that entire trauma response. So basically, if you are reacting to situations emotionally, there's probably a trauma. Basically, if there's anything that happens in your life that evokes a negative emotional response and turns you into a different person than you normally are, you're probably traumatized on some level around something, right? If every time someone laughs, you feel negative and you get angry, right? You probably have a trauma where someone laughed at you at some point in your life where your subconscious recorded it as a trauma, right? So basically, if you want to see what your traumas are, you have to look at the triggers. You can't see your traumas without the triggers. So as you get triggered by different situations, pay attention to the things that are triggering you and make note of that, and then see if you can go back into your life and see a time in your life where there was a situation that relates to that your mind thought was, bad enough to threaten your survival, and then see that there's probably a trauma around that, right? And once you figure that out, I can heal it very easily. But that's just to start helping you become more aware of why you react the way that you do in different situations. I will make another video about repeating trauma loops and trauma cycles, which is a very key component of this. But for now, just understand that trauma is normal, it's natural. It happens to everybody and every animal that's in existence. And it's when that process is not allowed to complete, then you get a traumatic imprint, right? And then that traumatic imprint has to actually be healed before you return to normal, right? So I make you normal again. So that was a very kind of wordy, long-winded response. Please let me know if that made sense. I know it was very complicated. If you want the real details of it, read that book. But if you want it healed, that's where I come in. So once again, I am Jedediah Thomas. If you have any ideas for content that you want me to talk about, just let me know in the comments. Other than that, like and subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you on the channel. All right, thanks. Bye.